So I'm going to show you exactly how we deal with the data in the photosynthesis lab. If you remember, we cut out some discs from the spinach leaves, and what we did was we measured how long it took for each of these discs to float to the surface. And they floated to the surface because they were producing a gas. Now, they were also using oxygen in cellular respiration. Remember that plants do so, but for the most part we can think of each of these discs rising because of the oxygen that resulted as a byproduct of the photosynthesis. So when we look at these discs, every one of these discs that rose, we measured their time and the time it took for them to rise. So you should have a data table at some point. And at this data table, we should have the following. You should have a data table at this point where it has maybe disk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 10, and you should have some kind of time value. And I told you to do that, not only because we first did it, we weren't having much success, and people are waiting a lot of time to see the disks rise. We're going to convert this data table, where we have a time for every disk, into one where we have frequencies. What I mean by that is, we're going to make a new data table. And in that data table, we're going to look at exactly how many of these disks rose in a time period. So if we look at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll stop at 5. What this represents, the 1 minute mark, would mean any disks that rose from 0 to 1. So if there was a disk that rose at 32 seconds or 59 seconds, we would count that as one disk. Okay, so you do that in your data table. If, let's say, you had 3 disks that rose between the first minute and the second minute, okay, what we'd need is we would need some more values here, 2, 3, 4, and what we would do here is create a data table first, where if we had 3 disks that rose between the first minute and the second minute, what would that give us? That would give us total of 4 disks at the second minute. So what you're going to do is take your data table, and I'm going to make one up here so you can see what I'm talking about. So let's say my first disk was at 32 seconds, and that's certainly going to be very fast. So let's, I'll keep it that way, because depending upon the variables you were using, that could be the case. So let's say we have 32 seconds. And the second disk was at, let's say, 1:15, and the third disk was 1:16. We had a grouping of them, and you can see why it's probably advantageous to do it this way, because as disks start to rise in groups, it's hard to measure exactly when they come up. But if you give them a range or a frequency for the range, it's definitely a better way to do business. So let's pretend that this is our data. Let's say the 5th, okay, and we'll just leave that alone. Okay, so what do I have here? I have a grouping. The second, third, and fourth disk, okay, arose between the first and second minute. So if you notice the first disk, I have a 1 here. And the first minute, within the first minute. So we'll say that each one of these is a range. From the 0 to the 1 minute, we had 1 disk rise. And maybe if I do this better, the real range would be between 0 to 59 seconds. Once it hits the 1, we'll say it's between the 1 and the 2. And this would be from 1 to 1:59. Okay, so that's probably the best way to do the range. Alright, now so what we have, I'm not sure where that comes up, but what we have now is we have a grouping of 3 disks between the first and the second minute, or 1 minute to the 1:59 minute, right? So this group right here would be between the 1.00 to the 1.59. And at 2, you're in the next range. So essentially what you're going to do is take your data table, and if you have the individual times of your disk, you're going to group them into these ranges. And then you're going to make a chart or a graph here, like I'm making, where you're using the cumulative effect of all of your disks. So let's pretend that I am tall, which is not really much of pretending. Alright, let's get rid of this. Let's pretend in the 5th minute, alright, or the 5th disk, I'm sorry, these are the number of disks, I had one at 230. Alright, so let's erase some of these points here that we don't need. So I had another disk. So if you notice, let's say that in the 2 to 3 minute mark, I only had one more disk. Okay, so that doesn't go here. That means I'm going to add to the 4 that I have, and there's my 5th disk. So this would be the 5th disk, and it would be here. So you can see I'm adding a cumulative amount every time. So the grouping of 3 would be 3. Notice if I added one more disk at the 3 to the 4th minute, and I'm sorry, I should have done 2 to the 3. Yeah, the 2 to the 3 minute, we're adding the 5th. And you notice I'm using the 3 to represent the 2 to the 3. I'm using the 1 here to go to 0 to 1. I'm using the 2 from the 1 to the 2. Okay, so that's how we're working this. Now, as you can see, the 5th disk rose at the 3 minute mark. And what we would do is, in your Excel, you would basically draw a line graph between these dots. And what we would do is we would essentially, let me erase some of this, we're trying to come up with a median value. Now you have 10 disks, so your chart would grow for 10 disks. And the best way to probably gather this data is using a median value. A median value is the middle numbers. And the reason why we try to do this in this lab is because there's going to be some disks that we probably plasmolyze by pulling the pressure, negative pressure on, and crush some of the cell walls and cell membranes by taking the air out, or some that are dead. So we're going to eliminate all those types of errors by taking the middle value. So to do so, what we do is we find the 5th disk, wherever it may be. We hit the value, we hit that line, we do a straight line all the way down. Okay, and we estimate what that time is. And that time, we're going to say, let's say it's 3.2. I'll get out of the yellow because you can't see it. So we get 3.2. Now 0.2 is not a second, so we're going to take 20% of 60 seconds. Remember, these are 60 seconds in between, so you might want to think about what that is. So 20%, if I'm guesstimating this is 0.2, what's 20% of 60? So you know that, and you can do that and do that math to find those seconds. But that value for time, once we evaluate to 60, is going to equal, okay, the estimated time, all right, of 50% of your disks rising. So the ET50, estimated time for 50% of your disks rising. And that's how we do it. Find your 5th. Now, why am I choosing 5? That's a good point here, is I probably have 10 disks. So if you had 11, use 4.5. So what we do is, depending on how many disks you have in your graph, what you would do is certainly take half of that value. So I was assuming, and I can't assume, I make a donkey out of you and me, so we take the 5th disks. All right? So if you had 8 disks that floated, you would do this for the 4th, and you would take your 5th, do a straight line, find your line, go all the way down, and figure out your time. And then your time, okay, that would be your estimated time of 50% of your disks rising, and that's the value we're going to compare to your other data sets. And you should make really a bar graph of that compared. So if you did this test with, let's say, in red light, and then you did this same study, and then you did a bunch of another disk or a group of 10 disks, then you would compare the ET50 of, let's say, the red light with the ET50 of blue light. And I would like to see a definite graph of the ET50s, which is going to be your median value that represents 50% of when, basically, the time for 50% of your disks to rise. Don't forget that it really represents a rate, since we're measuring time here. Alright, so that's how you come up with it. Again, you're going to take your data, convert it into a range, okay? Then you're going to plot that cumulatively, so that as you add more disks, you keep the same number beforehand. We had 1 disk for the 0 to 1 range. We had 3 in the 1 to 2 range, so notice I went to 4. We only had 1 in the 2 to 3 range. Notice I added just 1 more to that. Then we find the half value of our disks. If we use 12 disks and 12 rows, we'll use 6. But the bottom line is we find a 5, we come all the way down with a straight line, we find that value, convert that into seconds, okay, and you go from there. So that'll be your ET50, which again is your rate, which you're going to compare to your other tests or controls, and hopefully that helped.